So our strategy today is to give you a holistic perspective of freedom of religion or belief. And we're going to start at the micro level, which is religious freedom in Utah. Then we're going to zoom out to the United States and end the day with a global perspective, which Nadine has given you a beautiful introduction to. So if I can invite our Utah panelists to come forward, Luna Banuri and Marian Edmonds-Allen, we're going to have a discussion about the conditions here in Utah, what divides us, what unites us, and how do we bridge these gaps. And AV's bringing forward those mics, so we'll get mic'd up. One thing to, please just pull up a seat here. One thing that I want to underscore as we start this discussion is what is religious freedom and what isn't it? So just to review, religious freedom is a human right that protects all people. All people. Well, what if I'm not religious? It still protects you because fundamentally religious freedom is about what you believe. And if you don't believe in a God or don't believe in a religion, religious freedom protects that. What else is it? It is for people of all creed and all faith. Is it just for Christians? No. It's for all people. Is it just for people of a certain political party? No. Freedom of religion or belief is the fundamental human right that makes us human. So with that in mind, please join me in giving a warm welcome to our speakers and this panel on Utah. Okay, we'll start here. So, Luna is the executive director of Muslim Civic League here in Utah, which is a coalition that brings together the Utah Muslim community to look at various issues, including religion, religious freedom. Luna, you've had incredible experiences working in the interfaith community. Can you give us a little snapshot of the religious freedom landscape in Utah, the history of interfaith here, and what Utah is, what we're looking at here in the Utah landscape?
Thank you so much, Rachel. Is the mic working? I'm wondering if you all can hear me? Okay.
Maybe try that.
Now? Yes. Yay. Thank you so much, Rachel. And my thanks to the Utah Global Diplomacy. I'm so used to saying Utah Citizen Council on Diplomacy. I had the honor of serving on their board for 6 years. And to see this organization come together and bring this critical conversation for Utahns really warms my heart. So more power to keep doing this work and moving forward. Speaking of Utah, I think Utah is on the crossroads, as has been mentioned in many different texts and many different conversations that we have around the country. We are also one of the states that New York Times article clearly indicated back in 2018 that we have not had any single public official ever issue any anti-Muslim sentiment, which is extremely rare given the previous administration and that its entire concept around religious liberty and excluding Muslims from that. We also have currently a governor who has made public announcements around welcoming refugees from all across the world. And he takes, and his administration takes this work very seriously. Our previous governor also was highlighted many times for doing this work globally on behalf of the refugee community. The Salt Lake Interfaith Roundtable, which was created as Salt Lake City was getting ready for the Winter Olympics. And this council was put together to welcome players and athletes from all across the world and provide them that religious accommodations while they were here in Utah. I do see Josie, who's currently serving as the chair. She has also served as the chair previously. This council is still doing important work in the state of Utah and has continued providing, once again, that ground for making sure that all communities are welcome. We, as Utah Muslim Civic League, came together to be able to create, once again, that bridge between different faith communities that are operating in the state of Utah. And we were lucky enough to create a coalition. For me, coming from Chicago into state of Utah, it was very curious to see that there were about 13 to 14 different mosques, and none of them had female representation, and a few service organizations, which were all led by Muslim women. So that created the pathway for myself to look at political engagement and political education, civic education. It is important for our communities when they arrive in US to understand how the democratic processes that exist, but it's also important for our policymakers to understand our community. The gap that I see in this space around faith understanding is, whereas we hear different political officials welcoming refugees from all across the world, the Black Muslim experience of being part of the plantation workers that were bring in, and the robust Muslim identity, since 19th century, is eliminated in public conversations. And when we talk about Juneteenth, when we talk about the Black experience in state of Utah, that entire piece is missing. And we, as an organization, are looking into various ways of intervention. That generally is the landscape. I would like to go more into the initiatives that are currently, are in play in Utah, but let me refer back to Rachel.
Fantastic overview. So we're getting a sense that Salt Lake has had an interfaith community since the Olympics that were hosted here. That was 2002. So at least 2 decades of people coming together about faith and religious freedom, and a lot of coalitions building with minority faiths, which is what I want Marian to speak to next. It goes without saying that there is a religious majority in Utah, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but there's a lot of minority coalitions, and that's something that Marian has seen and been a special advocate to. Marian is the executive director of an organization called Parity that works on the intersection between LGBT and faith communities, with a special focus on LGBT homeless youth here in Utah. So I want to hear from your perspective a little bit more about the majority-minority dynamics in Utah and your work seeing people come together across that majority-minority divide.
Yes, Rachel, thank you. And Luna, thank you for your work in the world. And it's such an honor to be here and to meet such amazing people. So I moved to Utah in 2011. I was invited to start a church here. I had planted a church in Texas that was LGBT affirming. And the thought was, well, if you could do it in Texas, maybe you could do it in Salt Lake. So I came here, and I came here with a lot of preconceptions. I grew up in Maine, and I'd heard about Utah. I had heard about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'd also heard about LGBT homeless youth. So I came here wanting to work on the problems that I'd heard about. And what I found was that while outside of Utah, there was a lot of media coverage of youth experiencing homelessness, within Utah, it wasn't something that was talked about. So our new church started working with young people. We would worship together, and then we would bring food and supplies to about 60 youth experiencing homelessness right in Salt Lake City. And from there, I was invited to run an LGBT youth center in Ogden. At the youth center, I met my very first homeless youth who came to the center. He'd traveled from northern Utah, and he'd been kicked out by his father, and he was looking for help, and he turned up at our center. And I thought, okay, I've seen shelters around. I know I can get this child some help. Well, I called different shelters and found that it was illegal in Utah to shelter youth, unaccompanied youth. It was assumed that a child without shelter was a child that was also with a family. So I started doing everything I could to raise awareness. I had public events. I became, when you hear the word activist, That was me. I was doing everything I could to get attention for the cause, and the media was very interested in the plight of youth experiencing homelessness. But I was getting increasingly frustrated because I wasn't making any headway at all, and a third of our young people that came to the center were experiencing homelessness. And in the wintertime, they still needed to sleep outside. They slept in abandoned homes and railroad cars, and some would freeze to death. And the suicide problem was absolutely terrible. Above Salt Lake in the canyon, there's a place called Suicide Rock for a reason. So I was getting increasingly angry, I'll be very honest, with the dominant religion and with people that I blamed for the problem of youth homelessness. So one day I had a public event, and it was about a bullying bill, and which I disagreed with, and there was a lot of media coverage, and the next day I had a phone call from the legislator saying, come and talk to me, I hear you don't like my bill. So I met with him, Representative Gage Furrer from Ogden, and I met his legislative aide, Laura Warburton. I told them why I was concerned about the bullying bill, that more children would get kicked out, and I ended up arguing with them about whether or not there were homeless youth in Utah. So I invited them to come to the center. Laura showed up at the center the next week, which totally surprised me that she would accept an invitation that wasn't given with love in my heart, shall I say? But Laura showed up, and we were walking down the stairs, and I remember this like it was yesterday, and we started arguing again about, are there homeless youth in Utah? And this small, slight young person edged by us to go down the stairs and to go to our small food pantry and started putting canned goods and things in a giant backpack. And Laura finally noticed this child and started chatting and found out this child was experiencing homelessness, and despite his saying, I'm 18, was 12 years old. I could see Laura's heart melt right then, and my heart melted too. I saw someone who I thought I hated feel compassion to children that I feel deep compassion for. So the next week, I had a call to come upstairs. We were in a small church basement with a tiny church parking lot. Marian, come help, there's a truck. And there was an 18-wheeler flatbed truck piled high with hundreds of coats. Because when Laura saw that homeless youth run up the stairs with this big backpack in a t-shirt in cold weather in early November, Laura yelled after him, "Where's your coat?" So Laura went home and called her church friends, and they gathered coats. Laura became a homeless youth champion. Laura knew the system in Utah for how to put forward a bill, how to change laws. I had never considered that. I was trapped in anger, and I didn't consider other possibilities, but this interreligious partnership that we developed between a faithful Latter-day Saint and a clergy person from the United Church of Christ then became this unstoppable partnership, because I could tell the stories, and Laura knew all these people that I didn't know. So Laura gave me credibility to show up in places I had never been invited to. And Laura could come and talk to people and talk about how people like her, faithful Latter-day Saints, had care for people that we all thought, oh, well, you just don't like us. Well, actually, they really did like us, and they really wanted to help. That changed my life, and that's Utah to me. That's why this is a special place for religious freedom and for interreligious cooperation.
Beautiful. And I think you've highlighted a lot of important aspects in that story, a few that I want to highlight as well. Freedom of religion or belief is not mutually exclusive. And one of the things that divides us right now are the stigmas about what it means to identify with a religion, what it means to identify with the LGBTQ+ community. People want you to think, especially media, misinformation, political campaigns, that you have to choose one identity. And if you choose one identity, you have to be 100% totally aligned Well, I have a public service announcement. This is misinformation. All of us are more than one identity. And that is what it means to have religious freedom. It means to be a woman and a Christian. It means to be a Christian and LGBTQ+. It means to be LGBTQ+ and cheer for the Lakers or be associated with a political party. So this is what we want you to remember as you go into your conversations with people. Are you going to agree 100% with people? No, and you don't have to, because religious freedom is about and. It's about intersections, and it's about being able to bring many identities, many beliefs to a shared space where we fight for a better society, like eliminating the homelessness of youth and preventing suicide. That's something that we can all get behind, regardless of our beliefs and our identities. So let's talk a little bit more about how we have seen the divides in Utah being bridged. So a shift now. Luna, you're doing incredible work with the Utah State Legislature. Can you give us an example or some stories about where you've seen a divide either in the Muslim community, the interfaith community? How did you overcome that divide? And talk us through those coalitions you've been part of.
Absolutely. So Utah ranks 6th in the interfaith rating, and I'm forgetting the name of the organization that nationally rates, different states and the kind of legislative work that they've done and the kind of international coalitions that they have joined. And 6th is a very good place to be in. In my experience, what I have seen is, let me kind of give a little bit of demographic breakdown. Utah has about, we keep talking about the dominant faith, but when we talk about other identities, we have about 14% Hispanic population now in state of Utah. We have about 1.5% of Pacific Islanders. Once again, religious identity is varied. And then 1.1% of Utah now is considered African American. And we as Muslims make about 1.1% of the state population. So when you are part of the minority, but also from a global minority majority religion, and you enter this space, I think by default we've become an interfaith or religious freedom advocates. And so any work that we partake, it is almost, in my mind, very clear that we are not going in only as a Muslim organization, but as an interfaith coalition. So some of the examples of the work we did was getting a athletic attire bill passed through the legislation this year, which allows for all religious minorities, students from religious minorities and moral standards to be able to reconform their uniform according to their modesty standards. So hijabs or Sikhs wearing their turban can play. And the reason we did not go in asking for just hijab accommodation was exactly because as a religious minority, we understand the challenges that all other communities are facing. We've had cases of Sikh kids made to sit out their tournaments wearing turbans, and it's made to the media and so on. So we built coalitions to do this work. Utah also this year passed one of the most generous bill around accommodations for students with different refugee backgrounds. So they can now pay in-state fee. Previously, the law was that if you have the refugee status, only then would you be able to pay in-state fee. With this bill now, you do not have to have just refugee status if you are a victim of trafficking or anything else. And this bill was just highlighted nationally once again. But there's also a struggle going on when we talk about reproductive rights right now and how the Utah legislature is looking at it and the kind of bans that have been put in place. We still have been able to come together as a coalition of religious organizations and have filed an amicus brief with the Utah Supreme Court challenging those very bans that have been put on women reproductive rights. So once again, it's also very curious for me as a practitioner to see that right now two main resettlement agencies in state of Utah, IRC and CCS, are led by Black Muslim men, both of them. One of them who came as a refugee here and has been able to do this work for 20 plus years and have had that respect and acceptance. And somebody who IRC just brought on their staff who has done international relief work as a Black Muslim coming into this state. So, but speaking of the challenges, it's also when I say that Utah is doing great work in terms of resettling refugees and so on. But when you're embedded in that community, the challenges we see, Utah is one of the largest multilingual, let's say, state in the country. They have robust language training programs, but right now in the refugee community, that's something that has become the biggest challenge, accessing ESL classes, right? We are not able to find proper free resources without language and transport. The refugees are, at a loss. So for next legislative session, that's something that we're looking at mitigating. What we also see is we have these large resettlement government agencies doing the work, but our experience with the Afghan community coming in 2 years ago, the government or the the resettlement agencies did not have provisions, for example, to provide halal food, right, or provide kosher food. And once again, that's something that we are working on as an interfaith council to mitigate. We, in Utah, state of Utah, once again, 6% of the population, prison population, identifies as Muslim. So not having religious accommodations in prison system is something that we're looking to challenge at the moment. So there's work happening, a lot of cooperative work. We also feel that the civil society within state of Utah, especially the robust private foundations, the way they're coming forward to support different minorities. Case in point, the sponsors of this organization and this conference itself, making refugees and immigrants part of the economic inclusion. Because if we don't look at the upward mobility of the minorities, then the entire state suffers in many different ways. So that's another piece that we're working on.
Yeah, amazing. You've touched on a lot of important points, and I want to circle back to the reproductive health point, not because we're about to have a controversial discussion, but because I know that all of you have strong feelings and opinions about reproductive health. So I'm going to pose a very difficult question, one that Marian lives in the tension of. Can I join a coalition if I fundamentally disagree with the values behind that? And how do we bridge the divide where I want to support a group that maybe I fundamentally disagree with? How have you seen that play out in the Utah landscape?
That's a wonderful question, and it's more and more important every day as we are told that we need to separate into different tribes and camps. So I have seen that happen here with the Utah Compromise, which you may all have heard of. It's SB 296 is the bill, and what it was people from governmental leadership and LGBT leaders coming together in conversation. And it started with friendships. And that was how it grew, from these friendships of, well, I like you as a person and I like you as a person. Why are we fighting publicly? Why can't we figure this out together? And they did. They had meals together and they figured this out. And it wasn't that some people then changed their beliefs to something else. It wasn't anything like that. It was about being in the fullness of your own humanity and appreciating that in someone else, and then finding the common ground that allows people to move forward. And what we're seeing in the religious freedom space is covenantal pluralism, which is that you can be in the fullness of your belief and you can work with someone else and you can achieve real things. I love that it's action-oriented. The religious freedom roundtables look for ways to help people in the world that are at risk of so many horrible things. And that's what we found in Utah, was that there were so many people being hurt, that the suicide rate was horrible, that people felt unsafe in their own religious beliefs, that there could be a way forward. And that's what's happening internationally, and that's what continues to happen in Utah, and it's happening federally as well with the Utah example. In Utah, we say we have a better way, which means that we can talk to each other and we respect each other deeply, not despite our religious differences and our political and ideological differences, but because of them. So going back to reproductive issues, having those differences means that you can create a wonderful team. If someone knows an issue on one side deeply and someone else knows the issue from the other side deeply, then they can come together, like Laura and I could come together, even though we had different perspectives on it, and achieve real good. So I believe that coming together across difference is our best way forward in the times that we live in now.
Yeah, and I heard an interesting insight on this. There was an annual review at BYU. They also were speaking about religious freedom, and Judge Griffith, who has been part of the Utah Supreme Court, made a very interesting comment. He talked about the root word of religion, which comes from a word called relgari, which means to bind together. So if in fact you are a religious person and you're living the fullness of your religion in the public square, then you should be binding together with people who believe very differently than you. And Marian has given us the key to success, and also Luna with her many examples of coalitions in Utah. It starts by knowing the people as people, right? So this could potentially be a challenge, but it doesn't have to be. One invitation I want to extend, if you're part of the religious majority in Utah, make it your goal to meet someone of a minority faith. Make it your goal to either join the Salt Lake City Interfaith Roundtable or to find some of the local organizations that are working across the minority divides and connect with someone at that deep level. I love how you said that. We have deep differences, but deep respect. And that is the starting point, because as soon as we know each other as people, then we can protect the human dignity that unifies us. I mean, think about your own families. Do you all agree on how things should be baked, when the cookies should come out of the oven, or what the best family vacation spot is? Of course not. And so we wouldn't expect anything else in society. We value deep difference. We value diversity. But don't let the world convince you that differences is where it's at. Differences is where we start. Human dignity is where it's at, and where we come together across our various lives and our various perspectives. So I want to shift and talk a little bit now about Utah in the U.S. landscape, as we're going to bridge a divide between U.S. and Utah. Can we talk a little bit about the Fairness for All Act? What is that? What does it mean for religious minorities like the Muslim community? How is it an example, and more importantly, a model for what freedom of religion or belief can be in Utah and in the United States? Comments on that?
Do you want to go first? Okay. So Fairness for All is legislation that was put forward by Representative Chris Stewart of Logan, Utah, who's a United States representative. And in essence, what it is taking the very real successes of the Utah Compromise and transferring that to a federal level. What is really beautiful about it is the coalition that works on this, which is a multi-faith and no-faith coalition of people who share their own deep faith, their beliefs, in service of a larger common good. So these are organizations like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the National Association of Evangelicals, the Jewish Orthodox Union, the Seventh-day Adventists, and on and on and on. There are many groups that are part of this. But what they all hold in common is a real deep desire for human dignity for all people, going back to the Declaration on Human Rights, going back to the principles of the Constitution, believing that it is not only possible to balance religious freedom and rights for minority communities, but that the two need to go together. And that's really what we're seeing in the world, that when there's successful ways forward, it's It's bringing together religious freedom and, in my area, LGBT concerns, bringing the two together to debunk the idea that this is so oppositional that it can't possibly go together. Well, it seems counterintuitive, but the reality is the two need to be together. And that's what we saw in Utah. In Utah, after the Utah Compromise went through, I saw an immediate decrease in youth homelessness. I saw an immediate decrease in youth suicides and attempts. I saw families that were staying together. I saw young people that wanted to go to college because they saw a positive future. That was the result of the Utah Compromise. So now we have visionaries who want that for the United States. But it takes courage of conviction. It takes the courage to stand strong in one's faith and then act in love. And we're seeing more and more of that. It doesn't necessarily make the news because, bad news gets the clicks. But I'm here to say the good news is there are so many wonderful people out there who long for a better way. And Utah always, to me, seems to be the place and the people that shows that way forward.
Yeah, Luna, what would you add from your experiences?
So I think the point that Utah is unique in its nature of how it deals with a lot of these issues. I also want to kind of point out the idea of equality and the idea of that when you are the forefront state, that you cannot actually pick and choose. So the compact, the racial compact that we have signed, or when the Arizona was introducing a very harsh immigration law a few years ago and the way Utah Compact came together, but then complete silence on Muslim ban, right? That itself speaks of, how are you aligning with various religious factors alongside. I know that the people of Utah did stand against it, but then did the church and our legislative, did they or not? Right now, for us as a community, another huge challenge is around the Afghan community that has come into state of Utah. They do not have, once again, immigration laws. They are on temporary status. We as an organization have been speaking to our congressional delegation to introduce the AAA Afghan Adjustment Act so that these folks can have equal rights truly, not only just in Utah, but all across. Once again, our expectation of the church as well as the legislature is to speak up about this issue. The disparity that we have seen between the Ukrainian refugees as well as the Afghans, that needs to be brought forward and have had question. And once again, this needs to come from the religious minorities, because this is exactly the issues that the state is facing with its welcoming attitude. So once again, I think we constantly have to put the lens back onto ourselves. As Nadine said, once you put out hate, you cannot bring it back. So we have to be very cognizant of that when we talk about inclusion and equality, that it runs across the board.
Yeah, and that really prompts me to share two stories that are very pertinent to Utah and Utah history. The first is a closer look at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who have, I believe, a unique stake on religious freedom. Let's talk a little bit about their history from an interfaith perspective. I know many of us are familiar with it, but Mormons fled to Utah for religious asylum. This state was founded on the premise of freedom of religion or belief, right? There was an extermination order issued against Mormons in Missouri, and they came here to seek refuge and start a new life. That's where we start the Utah journey. And now let's draw a parallel story with the Afghan refugees. I want to specifically tell you about a group of Afghan refugees that are here in Utah that have a parallel story to Mormon refugees, and that is the Hazara community. So Hazaras live in the central region of Afghanistan, Hazarajat, and they're distinct for many reasons. The first is their physical appearance. They are descendants of the Mongol tribes. So instead of looking Afghani, they actually look Asian and have very distinct physical attributes. They're incredibly wonderful, kind, and intelligent people, but they have been targeted because they practice a form of Islam that hybrids with Buddhism. And in fact, there's an enormous and beautiful statue of the Buddha in Afghanistan that was destroyed by the Taliban to particularly target the Hazara people. So you have Hazara Afghans who are fleeing the Taliban, fleeing an extermination order, seeking refugee status in Utah. Think about the parallels there. Think about what we could do as a state to rally not just around the Hazara, but many other specific minority groups within the refugee population. And let's talk a little bit about that, because I think when I hear the word refugee, when you hear the word refugee, maybe it conjures to mind specific images from the news. Let's counter that, and let's be a little bit more deliberate. Are all Utahns the same? No. Are all refugees the same? No. And refugees have incredible stories that mirror our own. That's really what I'm trying to highlight here. To be a refugee is not quite the same as to be homeless. To be a refugee actually means that you had a home and were forced from it, forced from your livelihood. But these are people with incredible skills and incredible stories. So Luna, tell us a little bit more about the other minority groups that you're working with. We've learned about the Hazara and their parallel story to the Mormon heritage here in Utah. What other groups should we be thinking about, including at the seat at the table? What other minority groups within the refugee population are you aware of that we can teach and share so that we have specific groups that we can reach out to and help support?
That's a very expansive question.
Good. We want the extended version.
And I feel I'm not qualified to speak about every group, but few that I can mention is we have a large Pakistani Christian community in state of Utah that I have not seen in other states. They are economically empowered. They're doing a lot of work. Pakistan's record on religious persecution is, one for the books, unfortunately, as well as, let's say, the Shia Muslims, right? Once again, they are not hierarchically equal to Sunni Muslims here. It is also very curious for me to see when we talk about refugees, right now, somewhere between 45 to 55% of the refugee population in state of Utah identifies as Muslim, and a very high percentage as Black. And so they're not African American, they're Black Muslims. And when we look at the entire Muslim sort of, once again, understanding of data, in the United States, 1/3 of Muslims identify as Black. We are a minority-majority religion. And then when we dissect that further, we are the #1 community with food insecurity. There is a misnomer around being Arab and rich and Muslim. 1/3 of Muslims identify at the federal poverty level or below. And how that impacts, once again, the Black American population. When we, once again, look at Utah, I have been doing research, let's say, on different pantries around food insecurity. Once again, we don't have accommodations for minorities. So they are, once again, food and asking for help is at the core of our honor system. As Muslims, we never want to ask for handouts. So when we do approach pantries, or if we do go out asking for help and not finding the right, ingredients or, religiously mandated, guidelines, once again, it creates barriers. So my focus really constantly comes back to is how, with our supportive, political system, can we make sure that the policies translate into action, right? That is the only way change is going to come. And at second level, as you have been inviting everyone to get to know each other, when we talk about Muslims nationally, they're saying when we are in news, we get 661% more focus on our, links with terrorism rather than our humanity, right? Once again, New York Times, I think, compared that cancer and Muslims get the same kind of media presentation, right? So in state of Utah, once again, we are opening up our doors and saying, get to know us. We're right here. We're amongst you. And we are looking for those avenues to connect with everyone. And that hierarchy, once again, that exists, that because the dominant faith looks at serving everyone, that refugees or immigrants need help, once again, disrupts that equality equation. We as immigrant and refugees can also help in so many ways. So don't look at us only when you want to help us, but also when you need help. We have talent pool, we have education, we have so much to offer. Include us in those places. I'm all about demographics. We have one elected official in the state of Utah identifying as Black Muslim. We have no other representation in any level of government here. And there are folks who are stepping up to run. When you don't see people like yourself represented, it obviously has an effect. And this applies to all religious minorities.
Yeah, great. I want to give you a chance to react to that first, and then I'll share some additional comments.
How can someone like me, all of us here, how can we be helpful? I hear what you're saying, Luna, and I think, oh my goodness, I want to be more helpful in the world. How can I be more helpful?
I think the work you're doing itself includes us. We have community members and youth that identify as LGBTQ. We may not want to acknowledge it because of our faith tenets and so on, and I think it's the same with other religious minorities or even majority. I think the important part as far as our work is considered is policy work. So anywhere, like I open up ourselves to any kind of trainings that you need for your congregation or your coalitions and so on. We are very willing to provide those trainings. We are very willing to provide that data. But other than that, we can identify the mosques that are all around the state, and we welcome you to all of it. Another big, huge accomplishment that we were able to secure last year was getting Utah to sign on July as the Muslim American Heritage Month. And right now, Congress has just introduced a new bill to do this all across the country. We are the second state in the United States. So we are ahead of the curve. So in month of July, you will see a lot of activities that we are putting together for everyone to get to know us and our heritage. So, take these opportunities. Wherever you are, we as a coalition are happy to connect you with congregations, people, communities, so on and so forth.
And I'm going to pose the same question to you, Marian. How can we help the LGBT community, and what would that look like in Utah?
In Utah, there are some wonderful organizations working directly with LGBT youth. So I would say look and see what's in your local area. Beyond that, what I do is I provide opportunities for congregations and organizations to create care kits for youth experiencing homelessness in Utah and beyond. So get in touch with me, and what I do is I come and speak, or I Zoom and speak and talk about youth homelessness, and then provide a service opportunity that then directly benefits youth who are in need.
Amazing. And let's go back to the food point as well. You highlighted something very subtly that I just want to circle back to, which is don't just think that we're asking for help, but that we can give help, which is a fundamental point of advocacy. I was sharing a story yesterday from my own personal life. I have a sibling with type 1 diabetes, and they were diagnosed at 8 years old. Type 1 is genetic. It's not related to eating habits or dietary choices. And at a very young age, I learned that advocacy is not speaking for someone. It's speaking with them. And that's what Luna's pointing to here, right? I remember going to school with my sibling, and if I ever tried to make claims about diabetes or what it was like, I would get a firm shove in the shoulder or a dirty look, because that is not my lived experience, and it is not really my place to be speaking for that experience. My best advocacy is when I'd say, this is my sibling, and they're going to tell you about some of their unique needs. I'm here to support. Then they could speak for themselves, and we could echo those voices. So what would it look like to fill some of these food gaps? I think it'd start by speaking to the Muslim community directly and asking about some of those food needs. And is that something that people can reach out to you, Luna, to coordinate, or how have you seen some of that food insecurity being addressed?
So we have this dialogue, a year-long dialogue group with the LDS Church Communication Department. And, once again, them being on the forefront of providing services to the refugee community. And we did a presentation on what does halal mean and how that it's, once again, it's not a term where it's about food equality. It is about, and I had people from that communication council say that they, for health reason, would like to switch using halal meat because the concept of kosher or halal means better health in reality and so on. Some states have laws which follow the halal guidelines, which is basically to make sure that the animal's blood is completely drained out before it is used for human consumptions. Sometimes we're not aware what the state laws are around that. So getting the state to be involved in that, explaining what their laws are, and then taking into account what are the minorities that have needs. The Jewish community has a large need around kosher meat. We had a meeting with some of the incarcerated youth 2 days ago, and there was a Muslim identifying child who told us that his parents bring him halal food every single day to the correctional facility. And that at this moment they don't have any accommodations and so on. So once again, I am all about making change at a macro level. So we once again can provide data on other states who are following these guidelines. Utah is ahead. Let's stay ahead in making these changes. But also for everybody that is from out of state to look at Utah as a model with these changes and help us get the word out of how we accomplished this. And once again, I cannot put myself in a position. I have a lot of partners, a lot of very dedicated partners on ground. Another group that I would really like to mention is United Together, Stronger Tomorrow. It is a coalition of interfaith, civic, and labor leaders, and they're picking up common themes around, let's say, childcare, right? Access to healthcare for all, and are doing legislative work and intervention from grassroots to ask for these changes in our communities.
Amazing. So lots of ideas. I hope you're all taking notes and putting down these organizational names. I want to shift now to a very important part of panels and a very important part of conferences. As you've noticed, there are just 4 chairs on this stage. And it'd be very difficult to get a chair on the stage for every single group in Utah or represent every single group in Utah. It's not really the function of a panel, but we can still acknowledge them. So I want to take some deliberate time right now. We've heard the Muslim perspective. We've heard the LGBT perspective. Can we just pause and think about what other groups are not represented on this panel but are represented in Utah, and think about some of their needs and make sure they're part of the conversation. So, Luna, you've mentioned the Black community in Utah. I also want to mention the Jewish community. There was an instance a few years ago where a synagogue was defaced with a Nazi symbol in Salt Lake City. There is anti-Semitism here, but there's a strong coalition to protect Jewish interests and to protect freedom of religion, so I want to touch on them. Can you think of other communities that we should mention? And this is not lip service. We're giving them time and space here on their panel, even though they can't be with us physically. They're still part of who we are and our thoughts and the action we're going to take. Can you think of other groups that we need to remember, or how do we find additional groups? How do we educate ourselves and make sure that we're including everyone in the conversation and in the action we take?
I just want to acknowledge the Jewish community and their work around the anti-hate legislature. Once again, that they were instrumental in passing. As my friend Rabbi Spector always says, that there's one Jewish person against 10 Muslims in state of Utah. But they're smaller in numbers, but they are at very key coalitions. They do wonderful work. Anti-Semitism is well alive in state of Utah, unfortunately. And that is why we align ourselves very closely with the Jewish community, because the bowl through which anti-Semitism is fed is the same bowl through which Islamophobia gets fed. So for us, it is extremely important to stand shoulder to shoulder with our Jewish brothers and sisters. Utah, once again, was the only state where the entire Muslim community, every single congregation, and every single Jewish congregation came together to issue a statement when that incident happened of saying, we in this state are together. And anything against one group means you're going against the other group as well. We are collaborating on this conference, Eradicate Hate, in Pennsylvania. Is it Pennsylvania? Yes. No, Pittsburgh, sorry. Around, once again, the anti-hate work that's happening in the state of Utah. We have a coalition which is represented by, let's say, Hispanics and various other communities, and we're making sure that our communities get educated around how can they use these laws that have been created and where are the gaps in these laws in state of Utah where we need to band together. I know I focused on one particular group, and I'm going to shift back to Marian and come back with some of the other groups that are operating in this space.
Yeah, great. And again, we're not speaking for them, but we're speaking with them. We're just trying to identify and broaden our conversation here. And if you're watching this recording or engaging with us online, this is your invitation to contact Utah Global Diplomacy, Bellwether, Parity, Utah Muslim Civic League, and tell us about your community, tell us about your stories. This is an invitation to speak and be heard as much as anything. So we can't speak comprehensively for every group, and we're not going to try, but what we're doing here is trying to speak with the groups and identify a few other groups that we should be thinking about today. Marian?
One group I want to mention is called Cherished Families. Cherished Families was an early partner of mine a decade ago when it was hard for me to find partners, collaborators to work with. Cherished Families is located in southern Utah, and they work with individuals who are part of polygamous communities, whether these are individuals looking to come out of a polygamous situation or they are content in their situation. But for someone in a plural community, it's very difficult to get medical services. It's very difficult to get food. Anything you can think of, there are barriers in Utah and beyond Utah. There are folks all over the country, all over the world, and they're often overlooked. And Cherished Family does amazing work with the most vulnerable people I can think of. So that is one organization that's very important. Another, not a particular organization, but is the groups that do good in the world that aren't faith-based. They need to partner with our groups that are faith-based to keep them in mind, to reach out, because we can do so much more together. And it helps to bridge that divide of, oh, is it faith or not faith? Actually, we are human beings looking to do good in the world. So thinking about, oh, I know a group that works on food insecurity. They're not faith-based. Hey, let's give them a call. Let's work with them.
Yeah, fantastic. And let's touch on that non-believers for a moment. Humanists are an atheist group in Utah, and it's slightly different than atheism. Humanism is centered around the idea of human dignity and what it means to be human. So find the humanists in your community. Atheists, agnostics, these are all different groups within the non-religious identity that we can be thinking about. So our time is short. I want to just prime the pump. We're going to take 10 minutes of questions. So start thinking now if you have particular questions about Utah, about some of the themes we've talked about. But I just want to end with any of your final comments. What you've learned from this panel, what you're thinking about, the actions you're going to take, and of course, any last words or thoughts on freedom of religion or belief.
I don't think I have time to synthesize everything, the pieces of questions you asked, but I do want to bring forward something that we are once again facing in state of Utah is around Bible banning from the public school and how that is playing out in our community and where it stems from and which direction we're going on. And I think, once again, as Utahns, we really need to have a conversation around the concept of banning and the way it affects, once again, I don't think this bill was enacted to ban Bible, but this is exactly the after effect of having these kind of legislative bills that create things. For me, in terms of learning, just being in this space, having spent yesterday with some of the speakers, and just getting a glimpse of the breadth and span of this work, it motivates me to constantly get out there within our own community as well as the mainstream community to, be the bridge builder, constantly bring people together, be the connector, and hope that humans itself has the capacity to evolve, learn, and move forward. And I also feel by coming together, there's data on that you cannot change people's minds. And if you can, there are 3 principles through which you can: humor, music, or having a spiritual experience. And to visit each other in our spiritual spaces or giving each other that spiritual experience, I think will manifest change itself.
That's beautiful. I love that. I just want to express gratitude to all of you in the room. We had a dinner last night where I met several folks, and I know others who are friends from different contexts. And I am grateful to each of you for what you do. And I wish we did have the opportunity and the time for everyone to share the amazing work that is happening. And I just want to say thank you, a deep, deep thank you, because you're making the world a better place for all of us.
Thank you both. I'll just end by saying that Utah really is an incredible place. I grew up all over the United States. I moved basically every 3 years my whole life. No, I'm not from a military family, but I am part of a very ambitious family that believed in entrepreneurship and opportunity, and I'm grateful for that. But I graduated from high school in Utah, and I attended university in Utah, and it has become for me a symbol of what religious freedom can be. Utah is a model state. We have challenges, we have divides, but I think we have some serious tools, resources, partnerships, particularly from this discussion, that we can now draw upon and continue to be a model state and continue to be that refuge from the storm for people of all faiths, for Latter-day Saints, for Muslims, for LGBT community. I hope that Utah will continue to be an example of what freedom of religion or belief is for all people everywhere. And I hope that you'll take that to heart. So turning to you now, your questions, if you'll please phrase it as a question, and you can extend it to the whole panel. We'll each give short remarks, or to specific panelists. We have a mic in the back, so just raise your hand and we'll take a few questions now. Yes, up here in the front.
So I have a question for you. You had stated that when the LDS Church came, that's when religion started. Why did you not mention the indigenous people and their faith that they practiced themselves prior to that?
Yeah, thank you so much. Let me clarify. I did not state that religion started with Mormon refugee asylums. I said religious freedom was where the history of the state of Utah began. So Utah became a state shortly after Mormon refugees. Certainly, we need to think about indigenous communities and the people who came here before, and I'm so grateful you would give me a chance to clarify that and remember that. Faith has been in the United States long before anyone was a refugee here, and the indigenous communities experienced horrific genocide because of their faith and beliefs, and we stand in complete solidarity with Native American people, the First Nations people here. So I'm so grateful you would give that question, and of course anything you want to add. What I was trying to highlight is the fact that modern Utah statehood, which was initiated from the Mormon community, was a reflection of religious freedom. Certainly not the first time faith came into this territory. Certainly not, Mormons were certainly not the first people of faith to live in Utah. So that's the clarifying point. Any other thoughts or comments on the Native American community, which of course needs to be included in this conversation, and other thoughts on Utah's history there?
Thank you for bringing that topic on. I think land acknowledgement is the basic where we should start with. And I take it upon myself not having offered that today. I apologize for not doing that. And I think as an organization, that is something that we should look at every single time we are on the land of the ancestors here. And we need to do acknowledgement. I also want to highlight once again Utah's role University of Utah has made tuition-free option for the Native students. And once again, that's a model that needs to be taken all across the country. Third piece, I wanted to obviously add ourselves. About 1% of the Indigenous and Native American community identifies as Muslim. So when we talk about this community, there is diversity, once again, in there that we need to acknowledge as well. Thank you.
Other thoughts on Native communities?
One thing to add, I was speaking to a colleague just yesterday who was saying that instead of saying LGBT, they now say 2S LGBT, to acknowledge the fact that LGBT is something that we seem to have discovered in the 60s, and it came to, but no, Native Americans and Indigenous folks have a beautiful two-spirit culture, and much more than that. That's just shorthand for it. So, Rachel, I appreciate your comments, and I thank you so much for bringing that up, because it's a topic that we don't talk about enough, to our detriment as a society, because we have so much more to learn and to recognize that will benefit all of us. And thank you for your courage in saying that. It was really important.
And let me just highlight too, I think there's two really, really important phrases in advocacy, and you've just heard both of them. The first is "I'm sorry." The second is "thank you." So both can be incorporated in that. And also I'm going to add a third statement, which is "I'm learning." Let's make learning a critical part of our advocacy. We're going to forget or leave groups out. It's not always intentional, and thank goodness we have a diverse group of advocates to bring in the voices that we forget. So let's practice those phrases in our advocacy so that we can all be learners and our advocates and remember those groups, particularly the natives of Utah, which is where the name Utah comes from. It's an indigenous term for the natives here. So thank you for that question. Yeah, second question in the back.
Okay, I want to tie a string around this last question and bring it back to this question about how do we engage young people in this discussion in schools. With you highlighted the dangers of Bible burning. And in my children's school, we had a teacher who was fired because she passed a wipe to a child with ashes. And the teacher did not know it was Ash Wednesday. And the child didn't know how to speak up about it. And it was just a routine thing to pass the wipes, and the child wiped the ashes. But then the grandparents started a lawsuit, and the teacher was fired, and there was no discussion. It was totally taboo. And I feel like we lost a big opportunity where we could have come together and said, "I'm sorry, I'm learning, and how do we do better?" But instead, everybody got silent, the teacher was fired, and the classroom was unallowed to talk about religion.
Wow, yeah, so you're touching on a big part of what we all experience, cancel culture, and how that affects religious freedom. And you've just touched on it, and we just kind of experienced this together, right, this moment, where I probably could have been canceled just for a moment there for leaving out a very important part of the conversation. But just like you said, we need to open spaces instead of closing them. So how do we model that? The first is that I think most people in Utah do not have malicious intent. There's just learning that needs to be had. So when it comes to book banning, when it comes to, which is a very serious problem in Utah right now, when it comes to some of these issues, what that signals to me is that we need to open spaces to learn and not cancel people. All of us have said the wrong thing at the wrong moment. I'm always the person at the wedding who makes the wrong joke at the wrong time. So let's acknowledge that we're human. Let's acknowledge that we make mistakes. And let's try to create those spaces. What would that look like? How do we create those spaces for, let's say, a book banning conversation, or in this case, some misunderstanding about a very important religious tradition, Ash Wednesday? How do we open those spaces? How have you seen that done?
I think bringing history back into our curriculum and acknowledging the communities that exist in the state of Utah and in other places as well, and allowing ourselves to learn from history is important. So once again, the curriculum discussion of how inclusive it needs to be has to be expanded. This bill about Bible banning actually stemmed from Representative Ivory's bill, where he wanted parents to have more say into the curriculum. And these were the unintended consequences of when a parent filed a complaint saying, well, Bible has pornography. And that got Davis School District then to ban Bible. But also Davis County has been under investigation around their record on student engagement and racist incidences and so on. Once again, at a micro level, for our community, the statistics show that 1 in every 8 Muslim child is bullied in schools across America. And 70% of the perpetrators are the administration or a teacher, right? And Muslims also have the highest suicide rate as well. So I'm sure the other communities have more understanding of these numbers for each and all. We as an organization have been bending backwards to provide training to our teachers. I feel saying that Utahns have good intentions should have an expiry date. Because you cannot claim to not know and keep causing the harm. We live in a global world. If you are positioned as a global state that is, doing this work internationally, then we need to once again look inward and create policies where groups like us can come in and train our elected officials, to teachers, to school administration, and to the groups doing this work, raising advocacy and so on.
Oh, Jad, Marian, how do we bring people together on this?
I think we need to have more events and conversations like this where people are invited to share their deeply held beliefs. So this is religious freedom again, it's covenantal pluralism again, where you can say, I believe it's important that this book not be included. That's a tough thing to hear, and I am curious and I want to hear why someone would say that. What's their deeply held beliefs that lead them to say that? That's tough. But we need to be really courageous to have those conversations and to hear both sides, because those feelings, those opinions aren't going to go away. And if we don't allow the conversations to happen, it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. And then there's more lawsuits and people end up hating each other more, and there's more division. We need to have the tough conversations, and we need more people who are able to provide that space like you all do.
I spoke to a religious liberty lawyer yesterday. I asked him, do you think that religious freedom is over-litigated in the United States? And he said, it depends, which is a very lawyer response to that question, I might add. It depends on at what level the discussion is happening. If the government, for example, is trying to restrict religious freedom, sometimes working through the courts is the best and most efficient way. But in the case of this school, it sounds like litigation is probably not the first option we should explore. We need to have listening campaigns. We need to pull people into a room together and say, tell me why you believe this. Tell me how we can compromise, particularly in book banning. We can find solutions, and you can do something about it. So if you're wondering right now what you can do, you have a local council person. In the state of Utah, there's a Utah Board of Education. You have a local representative on the Utah Board of Education. You can call your school district. You can call the principal of the school, and you can encourage these conversations to happen. A conversation that's just as important as the PTA or your child's soccer team. These conversations need to happen. So if you're experiencing that, reach out to the people in your community and let's try it. It's going to be messy, but remember, we already have some language. I'm sorry, I'm learning, and thank you. And coming into that discussion with humility so that we can all be part of a solution. I'm seeing another question in the middle. Okay, yes, here and then in the middle.
This is for the Reverend. So earlier on, when you first started telling the story about the legislative aid, you caught my attention because you used two words I guess I didn't expect somebody with a collar to be using. You said you kind of offered her an insincere invitation to come, and then she actually showed up, which surprised you. That seems odd to me that you would have made an because you didn't have to do that. And as a person who is a clergy, it just kind of confuses me a little bit. And then you actually used the word hate in saying that, you had objections to not that person, but just their points of view. So I was hoping you could kind of explain that to me a little bit.
Thank you for that question. And it takes some humility for me to admit that, but it's important for me to admit that I have not always brought my best self to conversations. And at that time in my life, I was much more oppositional than I was trying to bring people together. So in that particular instance, I was incredibly frustrated that we were arguing about the very existence of youth who are at risk of dying. And so it was much more of a, well, why don't you come and see kind of thing, goodbye, was the invitation that I issued. And it wasn't an invitation, it was offered in sarcasm, which I'm embarrassed to say, but I need to be honest and transparent because I am a learning and growing person. So that's what happened. But Laura had graciousness and love in her heart that came from her faith. And she heard that, and rather than being offended and thinking, wow, what an awful person that is, she thought, well, I guess I'll go see then. And she did. So my hatred was met with love. And I learned from Laura then, and it's the way I try to live my life now. When I am met with hatred, I try to respond with sincere love in my heart because I believe there is some miscommunication that's happening. And I look for the opportunities for the light to shine in and for things to change. And sometimes it's those really contentious moments that turn to be the most beautiful moments of grace that then the world is changed. Laura went on to originate the suicide prevention hotline that is now the national hotline. That's Laura. And when she was told, leave LGBT out of it, you're slowing this down, Laura refused. And now it's seen as the most effective way to prevent LGBT youth suicide in the country. And that's because of Laura. She responded to my hatred with love. And we can all do that.
And Marian responded with humility. I just want to highlight your role in this story. Incredible to admit the change and transformation that we have all experienced, and amazing that you're willing to share that perspective with us. So not just Laura, but also Marian's courage in being changed by that experience and being willing to bridge that divide. The question here in the middle. Okay.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your words today. And the thing I wanted to ask the panel is something that we've kind of touched on a little bit already, but the idea of youth engagement in interreligious dialogue, because that seems to be the future, right? Most of us here are definitely not as youthful as we used to be, but that's the future. And so in Utah, what do you see as ways we can improve getting the youth engaged in these efforts to have more safe places to discuss interfaith dialogue? Thank you.
I'm trying to think of some institutional responses. I know that Interfaith Youth Corps that stems out of Chicago and has campus presence all across the U.S. is a group that youth is, very involved with. Having 3 kids, I've learned that it is extremely hard to ask them to join me on the table, and it is much easier to crash their table and insert myself by being the irrelevant person who doesn't know anything and go in with a hat of trying to learn from them. And I think that's the model, once again, that we apply in our organization, bringing kids in and asking them, what is it that you would like to work on? So once again, that leadership programs that allow this, our youth to present their priorities and have the opportunity to work on. It is one of our most successful program. We bring in, 6 to 10 kids every year and put them through this leadership program. What we are also doing is creating singular line dialogues, like we're looking at creating a Jewish youth and a Muslim youth dialogue. We are already doing it with LDS. A lot of folks are involved with Interfaith Council and so on. These are some of the things. Once again, I don't have a ready response. I'm not an expert in this, but just some efforts towards bridging this gap.
I would add that religious freedom is a perfect way for youth to get involved, because youth, I have 4 kids, they're really highly interested in various topics, and I will just mention to them, not crash the table, because that's a very real point, but just mention that, there are other groups, they may be faith-based, that can be of real help to you. And so their eyes light up because they see, okay, here's some resources that might help us achieve our goal. And to that end, to highlight a wonderful effort that's happening is Patrice Peterson, who has this visionary idea of a global open space youth effort around religious freedom, with people all over the country, hundreds, and we're hoping for 1,000, where people can share, young people can share what they're interested in and what they want to see the world to be like, and that religious freedom can be the avenue for all of us to come together. Because it's not just about belief, it's also about non-belief. Religious freedom is about human dignity. And so there are tremendous efforts that are happening. And Patrice, raise your hand, please. Patrice is doing amazing work in the world. Please talk to her if you're interested in that, if you know some young people. So they're fantastic people doing wonderful things.
Couldn't agree more. And let me just add another point. Youth want to be taken seriously. Mm-hmm. So one strategy I would recommend, being a younger person myself, is to ask youth of all ages how they would like to be introduced and how they would like to come to the table. And they will tell you. Youth have they have a lot of clarity about who they are and who they want to be. And that can be on social media, but it could also be in person. And this is where the Interfaith Youth Corps does, I think, an amazing job. They go to youth and say, how do you want to be involved? How do you want to be introduced? How do you want to lead this movement? And it's created an amazing space for youth to come, some as listeners, some as leaders, some as social media campaigners. Let me also just highlight one other thing that Utah is doing really well. Across the state of Utah, there are religious freedom charters at almost every university in Utah. So Brigham Young University has a freedom of religion or belief student chapter. Utah Valley University has a very strong interfaith and religious freedom program for the university. University of Utah has found an amazing balance between interfaith, native discussions. I think this is where University of Utah actually is leading the way. So find your local university and also think about youth in a broader term, which is those kind of transitioning between university and professional life. And again, take them seriously, ask them how they want to be introduced and how they want to come to the table, and then you'll find a broader engagement. So